Oncoming motorists in North Carolina saw what looked to be a little girl walking along the highway. In the midst of a thunderstorm, she was alone and shivering. No one thought to come forward with this information until a police investigation started later that day. But when these witnesses detailed what they saw, it would start the police on a baffling mystery that would stretch over 20 years. But now, in 2024, they're closer than ever to find out what really happened in those elusive early morning hours. Now, before we go into the story, I'm OriKat and welcome to my channel. I deliver cases to you in a dramatisation format, so if that's something you enjoy, you'll be happy to know we upload once a week. As always, my aim is to give a voice to the victims and remember them as they were. So with that, let us begin. This story starts off on February the 14th, 1988, Valentine's Day, a holiday to embrace romance and show appreciation of one's partner. It was on this day Harold and Asha Degree got married. Enjoying a strong bond and a happy marriage, Harold and Asha welcomed their first child a year later. This baby boy was called O'Brien. And then 2 years later, on the 5th of August 1990, they had their second child, a baby girl named Asha. The Degree family had lived around Shelby, North Carolina, for their whole lives. They were a close-knit family with their extended family nearby. And Shelby, also known as the City of Pleasant Living, was somewhere that embraced all the urban and nature influences. Some parts of it consisted of the beautiful rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, whereas others were much closer to the more metropolitan areas of the Carolinas. Shelby consisted of roughly 19,500 people when Asha was growing up, with the majority of the population not only consisting of Caucasians, but African Americans too. Harold and Asha worked ordinary daytime jobs, consequently making Asha and O'Brien latchkey kids. This started when they reached the age to attend school at around 5 years old. Latchkey kids were basically children that looked after themselves for a certain period of time, kind of before or after school, whilst parents were at work, so they typically had no adult supervision. From kindergarten onwards, Harold and Asha thought that this encouraged youthful independence, and for the most part it did. Asha and O'Brien had no trouble finishing their homework and doing chores by themselves. And their parents completely trusted the school, Falston Elementary, to return their kids safely. Asha specifically understood the need to stay safe when coming home from school alone. She would always navigate carefully and was very wary about talking to strangers. In fact, these great inbuilt instincts were even present when she was a toddler. But on the whole, Asha was known to be a sensitive girl who was full of empathy. She loved her entire large family, all her school activities, and loved participating in basketball, sometimes baseball. Consequently, the area of Shelby was very into baseball as a whole. It held the annual American Legion Baseball World Series every year. February the 11th, 2000 was a good day in particular. It was a Friday, and Asha and O'Brien had the day off. They went to a family member's house down the street, stayed there for a little while, and then they returned home. The day after, on Saturday the 12th of February, 9-year-old Asha played in a league basketball game. She was the point guard, which was arguably one of the most specialist positions out of the 5. The point guard were usually expected to run at the opposing team's defence whilst controlling the ball. A lot of it relied on perfect timing. Really, Asha's job was to find ways to facilitate great scoring opportunities. And she was really good for her age, and she was especially appreciated amongst her peers. There was many times she had elevated the team in crucial moments. So on this particular Saturday, the team had been unbeaten up until this point. Unfortunately, that changed and the girls were defeated. Now, all the girls on Asha's team were fired up with competitive spirit. They cared about it a lot, and they really wanted to win. Asha especially had high expectations on herself to perform. But sadly, the girls took the loss hard. enough to even bring them to tears and convince them to walk around the court faking injuries. One of their teammates eventually told them to cut it out. So Asha, like the rest of her peers, picked herself up and resolved to watch the other games. She was happy to move on to support O'Brien's own game. Despite this enthusiastic camaraderie she had with her team, Asha was still typically quite a shy, reserved personality at home, perhaps a bit introverted. And because of her reserved personality, the Degree's simpler lifestyle really suited her. It might have been unusual to some, but Harold and Aquila, especially when their kids were born, started to become very cautious about the world in general. More particularly, the developing effects that new technology had on children's brains. This made them prompt their children to have a relatively small, close and comfortable social circle, consisting of their extended family as expected, the church community, and the local school. The byproduct of the Degrees trying to keep technology out of their household meant that they didn't even have a family computer. Aquila further reasoned that the nightly news at the time always seemed to be about predators trying to lure children over the internet. As I've said, Asha didn't really mind this lack of technology, it complemented her more, cautious nature. She seemed to like being under the close watch of her family, revelling in that intimacy. She never really did stray from good behaviour. On the whole, Asha wasn't too keen about leaving the house. The biggest cause of this was her crippling fear of dogs. She was terrified of them and her parents struggled to persuade her otherwise. Anyway, after the basketball game, Asha had a sleepover with some of her teammates and her cousins. She had a lot of fun getting to stay up a little bit later than usual. The girls basically watched TV well into the night. On Sunday, the 13th of February, Asha and O'Brien had a relatively normal day. They did their homework, their chores, and then played together with their toys for a bit. But it was on Sundays they attended church. So they went and did that, and then afterwards they went to go visit the residence of one of their cousins, Shalonda Bryan. It was there Asha and O'Brien's grandmother gifted them with candy and cologne. Once they got back, Asha was particularly exhausted, so the children were basically in bed by about 6:30 p.m. It would be a couple of hours later until the children were awoken by the sound of loud booming thunder and the harsh pattering of rain. At around 9 p.m, Asha and O'Brien went downstairs to watch TV with their parents. Being so young, both were unsettled by the chaotic weather, Asha in particular, because in a similar way that she feared dogs, she was also really frightened of thunderstorms. So the children sought comfort with their parents and stayed up with them for a little while, until the power was suddenly cut off. Because elsewhere in Shelby there had been a motorcycle accident due to the conditions. The motorcycle had crashed into power lines, causing many of Shelby's residents to be without light. Whilst the children had been down there, Aquila had originally thought that perhaps she should give them baths before going to school tomorrow. But now, considering the blackout, she thought it was just best if she got them both back into bed. Kids don't tend to like the dark very much, so Aquila was very proactive, comforting them and getting them tucked back in. Asha hated the dark. Knowing it was there meant she often struggled to sleep. 2 hours later, at around 11 p.m, Aquila decided that she was going to start getting ready for bed. Their residence was on the smaller side, so she usually took the bed, whereas Harold usually took the couch. So while she was doing this, Harold decided that he wanted to get an impromptu gift for his wife. To celebrate Valentine's Day coming up tomorrow. Because for them, Valentine's Day did have a double meaning. As you remember, it was also their wedding anniversary. By around 12:30 a.m, now it was officially Valentine's Day, and the power in Shelby had been restored. This woke Aquila up, who consequently went downstairs to get Harold, who by this time was back from the shops. She asked him to move the kerosene lamp she had previously had at her bedside to give her a little bit of light. She tells him once he's done, then he can go sleep or watch TV or whatever. With the poor weather conditions raging on, Harold did find he just couldn't get to sleep, and so he settled on watching TV. At around 2:30 a.m, he decided to go to bed himself, but before this, he wanted to check on Asha and O'Brien and to see that they were still sleeping okay. Knowing the thunderstorm was scary for them, he just wanted to make sure they wouldn't be stressed out. And when he looked in on them, they were sleeping peacefully. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, O'Brien was the next one to wake up in the house. And at this point, obviously it was really dark in the room, he was bleary-eyed and still really tired, so he didn't really know much about what was going on. He thought he heard Asha stirring and making a trip to the bathroom, but unable to fight off his persistent tiredness, O'Brien went back to sleep with no further knowledge of Asha's movements. It is between this moment and 4 a.m. that Asha is most certainly awake, unlike her brother. Trying her best not to disturb him, she got her rucksack, packed it with sweets and clothing, and then snuck out of the room. Family none the wiser, the last thing Asha did was take her house keys and quietly make her way out of the front door. Despite the torrential rain and nearly sub-zero temperatures, she didn't even take a coat. At 5:45 a.m. on a Monday, Aquila woke up like she usually did and was getting ready to wake the kids up and get them ready for school. However, when she went to check on the children, she soon saw that O'Brien was still sleeping soundly in his bed, but Asha's bed was cold and empty. Going into panic mode, Aquila couldn't even speak as she went rushing around the house trying to find Asha, her maternal instincts kicking in sevenfold. She searched every nook and cranny of their home, and during all this commotion, Harold was woken up to his wife's crippling fear. Horror washed over Harold as Aquila filled him in, and he too joined her frantic search. They soon discovered Asha's house keys were missing, prompting them to believe she must have left the house willingly. Sure, she was independent enough to do that, but there's no reason why she would want to. It was horrible and dark out, and there would be nothing but the occasional lightning strikes to light her way. There would be dogs barking in the distance, and it would be bitterly cold. A child, especially one so reserved, would never do something that overwhelming. Of course, like a lot of children, Asha had voiced running away before, but young children didn't really do it even in the mists of anger. They got out the house but never usually got too far, or they would pack their bags, but still not leave. Harold and Aquila called the grandmother, hoping, for whatever reason, that Asha had just simply gone there. I mean, the residence was in walking distance. The grandmother, sharing their worry, informed them that she hadn't seen Asha at all, not since that previous day in which Asha and O'Brien visited their cousin's house. Exhausting nearly all of their solutions, Harold and Aquila had no choice but to just burst out onto the street. And they were getting absolutely soaked by this point, but they just constantly walked up and down the street desperately screaming Asha's name. They did this for half an hour, but with no progress, the Degrees soon called the police at 6:39 a.m. The police wasted no time getting to the residence. In fact, it only took them around 6 minutes. Approaching the house, the police were met with rightly hysterical parents. So they soon saw that this was a much bigger and more serious situation than they had originally anticipated. Now at this point, a young child was on the line, so the sheriff really did pull out all the big guns. He involved search dogs, a whole rescue operation, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations. By about 2 p.m, this whole planned search effort had really come together. The Degrees' house was taped off by police, and the state investigators searched every inch of it. The main things they were looking for was proof of forced entry, whether someone had broken in and taken Asha, or if there was any foul play coming from anywhere inside the home. These two issues of concern were pretty much ruled out straight away. Through searching Asha's bedroom themselves, and through her parents' recollection of her belongings, the police were soon able to build an inventory of Asha's missing items, things she most likely brought with her or put on for this sudden excursion out of the house. The missing belongings included blue jeans fastened with a red string, a white shirt, another black and white shirt, black overalls with a Tweety bird image on the front, a black Tweety bird pocketbook, candy handed out after the basketball game, and house keys. During the day, the police didn't come up with many leads, until motorists came forward with stories about potential sightings. The first man, Jeff, stated that he saw a little girl walking along the North Carolina Highway 18 whilst it was downpouring at approximately 3:30 a.m. At this time, his location on the highway was about a mile south from Asha's residence. The second witness was a retired sheriff deputy. Roy Blanton Sr. had been driving along with his son, Roy Jr. They saw a sighting at about 4:15 a.m, but to them, at the time they thought it just looked like a woman who was of short stature. They reported this individual was walking down Highway 18, just about to come up to the intersection. This again was about a mile south from Asha's house. Roy did inform the police that he told other drivers over a CB radio to keep their eyes peeled, because there was someone out there in those hideous conditions alone. Trying to be proactive, Roy circled back a few times to try and track her and see where she was going, but he seemed to believe the figure soon caught on that his vehicle was following her, and it was clearly not one she wanted to see. Therefore, it prompted her to run from the road and into the nearby woods. This would be the last known sighting of Asha Degree, though the nature of it is at best unreliable, considering the eyewitness account was in the dark on a fast-travelling road. After Jeff and Roy came forward with their potential sightings, the police were able to establish about a 5-mile search radius near Highway 18. Unfortunately, because of the early morning rainstorms, a lot of potential scents had been washed away. The search dogs were struggling to pick up on anything. As the evening drew in, on a Valentine's Day that no longer held any special meaning for Aquila and Harold, Asha's parents were interviewed by the State Bureau. They were quickly ruled out as suspects and cooperated fully with the police. The following day, the police got really what was considered the first breakthrough on this case. It was Tuesday the 15th and the volunteer search party had already been deployed, and the next plan of action had been to search private property. The Turners were happy to help, and this was great because their property was basically an ideal search area for the volunteers to focus their efforts around. Like the sightings, it was south, a mile away from Asha's house, and it was relatively close to the highway. The couple invited the searchers to look at a shed at the back of the property, and when the wooden doors were swung open, the first pieces of evidence came to light. On the floor was a scattering of candy wrappers, as well as a green marker, a 1996 Atlanta Olympics pencil, a yellow Mickey Mouse hairbow, and a small photograph of a young girl. At first glance, the girl in the photo did bear some resemblance to Asha. When the police heard about this, it didn't take them very long to conclude that these must be the items that were missing out of Asha's residence. The police got to the Turners' property on the 16th of February, a day after the initial shed discovery. Naturally, the thing that garnered the most interest from the police was the random photo. Looking at the property as a whole, the police theorised that this was likely too far for Asha to have been able to travel to in those conditions. So realistically, who had left the stuff there? Leaving the Turners' property, the police were absolutely stumped to be called back the next day. More candy wrappers had been found, and the Turners explained to the police that that morning had been particularly quiet. They said they usually heard if a vehicle tried to park up. After this, the police decided to interview the families of the girls on Asha's basketball team and confirm that the candy wrappers they found were indeed the ones that matched the candy handed out after Asha's basketball game the previous Saturday. The police then passed this mysterious photo around to her friends and their families, as well as the elementary school students and Asha's own parents. All of them categorically said they did not recognise the girl in the photograph. So whilst the police decided that they would still keep the photo linked to the investigation, they did confirm that it was indeed not a photo of Asha Degree. The authorities searched for 3 more days, but after no progress, they had to scale their efforts back. The official search ended on the 28th of February, 2 weeks after Asha's last known sighting. Though the next chapter in the story unravelled just a month later, during a law enforcement investigation on the 22nd of March, 2 new updates were brought forward in the case. The first update was that billboards had been placed in the 2 locations Asha had been seen. These billboards asked oncoming motorists to look out for a missing person, detailing Asha's appearance, the number they had to contact if they had any new information, and of course the reward money of $45,000. The second update was that after interviewing a range of individuals, from Asha's family and friends to sex offenders in the area, the police managed to build a psychological profile of who they thought might be behind Asha's disappearance. The police never made public this psychological profile in an attempt to keep Asha safe if she was indeed still alive. Despite all the fascination around the circumstances regarding Asha's disappearance, typical of a cold case, further advances were few and far between. The next major one came on the 2nd of August 2001. A contractor, Terry Fleming, was driving his tractor along the side of a hill when it hit a clunky, unusual object. Getting out of the tractor, Terry walked around to see the blockage and noticed that there was something wrapped in plastic. Confused, Terry peeled back the crinkling material and peeked inside, and what he saw was a black book bag. Written on the inside of the book bag was a name and address that Terry wasn't familiar with. Now at this point, Terry didn't really know what to do. He was somewhere where there was no cell service, but he knew that in front of him was the bag of a child. He just had this unsettled feeling in his gut, like there was more to this than met the eye. So the morning after, on the 3rd of August, Terry showed it to his wife to get her opinion. She might have a better idea on what to do. And as his wife looked through the bag and saw the details, it was like a light bulb went off in her head. She was grave when she turned to Terry, and he had to brace himself for what she was going to say next. And when she looked him in the eyes, she said, "I recognise this name, and we have to go to the police, because this bag belongs to a little girl, Asha Degree." Immediately, the Flemings got in contact with the authorities, and the police wasted no time getting over there. Their interest was piqued, if not a little lost, because the Fleming residence was around 26 miles from where Asha was last seen. So when the police looked over the book bag, they noticed that it was covered in not just 1, but 2 plastic bags, and that it had clearly been intentionally buried. In fact, they had hypothesised that the bag had been there for a while, and lo and behold, with Asha's name written near the seam, all her missing items were found inside. Soon after this, the Charlotte Observer, the media of one of the cities nearest to Shelby, broke the news to everyone, along with the startling revelation that it wasn't just the original belongings in the bag. There were 2 individual possessions no one could ever recall Asha having. These were school supplies and clothing. Because of this, a new invigorated search began on the 15th of August, almost 2 weeks after the discovery of the book bag. But unfortunately, between less than favourable weather conditions and difficult terrain, the search was made unbearable. The authorities even did a 3-mile dig around the area, but the only things they could come up with were animal bones and a pair of men's khaki pants. The police neither confirmed or denied that the khaki pants had anything to do with Asha's case. In an effort to try and do another efficient search, authorities returned to the area 2 months later in October 2001. This time they were combing a 6-mile stretch down Highway 18, the original place Asha had gone missing from. And this 6-mile process was repeated for the total 26 miles, until they got from the disappearance site to the excavation site of the book bag. Along this 26 miles, the police interviewed as many different suspects and potential nearby criminals as they could. And once this entire search of this long stretch of North Carolina came to a close, the police were bitterly disappointed and Asha's family were heartbroken. After all the time and effort spent scouring the entire area of Highway 18 and everywhere surrounding it, there was nothing. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing that could further the case. And so it pained the community of Shelby to once again have to put a pause on their search efforts. This didn't stop Asha's family from campaigning for her return home, but the case did go stone cold. Or at least from the public's point of view. It was 15 years later, the police offered an update to the public in the hopes they could glean some new information. They revealed they were looking for the owner of a dark green 1970s Thunderbird or a dark Lincoln 4-Mark vehicle with rusty wheel wells. This development suggested that the police were potentially taking the eyewitness accounts around the time of Asha's disappearance more seriously. Because at the time, though it wasn't really considered in the initial investigation, some motorists said that they too saw Asha in the early morning hours alongside Highway 18. This was after the point, if you can remember, when Roy saw her run into the forest. Well, despite it being dark and admittedly a fast road, passerbys did say that they saw a girl coming out of the forest. She was young in age and was talking to someone who had pulled up on the embankment. She then, of her own volition, decided to get into the car. So it can be concluded from the rough eyewitness accounts that the police clearly think that the mysterious vehicle must have either been a Thunderbird or a Lincoln. Then, in the October of 2018, 2 years after trying to identify that specific car, the police leaked more advancements to the public. Investigators from the Cleveland County Sheriff's Department released a video.
This morning, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office announcing new developments in the case.
Our investigative team has discovered 2 items of interest that could possibly provide new leads about Asha's disappearance.
The first is information about this Dr. Seuss library book. Investigators want to talk to anyone who checked it out of the library back in February 2000. And the second clue is this concert shirt for the band New Kids on the Block.
If you had a t-shirt like this one, or know somebody who did at any point in time, please call us.
In this video, they detailed 2 particular items they were interested in. They gave no extra context or information, but claimed any valid information about the items would boost the search for Asha Degree. These 2 items were a Dr. Seuss book and t-shirt merch from the band New Kids on the Block. Up until this point, those working on the investigation had been tight-lipped. They weren't willing to share any information and clearly didn't want any internet sleuths to get involved. The silence on the police's end did nothing but cause the media to speculate. How could those 2 items be relating to Asha's case? And it was soon put together that those 2 items must have been the extra things the police had originally found in the book bag. The police first asked if anyone could come forward with information on the Dr. Seuss library book. If anyone in the North Carolina area had this book around the time of Asha's disappearance, and they'd found they had lost track of it, then they were urged to call the police. And secondly, if anyone recognised whether they used to have a New Kids on the Block t-shirt in their possession. As with all missing persons cases, theories have circulated about Asha's disappearance, and today we're going to be discussing some of them. The first is that she left without duress in the middle of the night. This is due to the fact that alongside clothes she also packed candy. The whole setup of the bag certainly looked like something a 9-year-old might want to take on an adventure. She made sure to have her favourite outfits and favourite snacks to help her with whatever goal she was trying to achieve. But I don't think this theory has much merit because of certain factors in the case. For one, no matter how adventurous Asha could have been feeling that night, nothing really did outweigh the fact that she was a reserved, frightened girl. She had a fear of not only dogs, but thunderstorms, and the dark, and these were all very real fears to Asha. It meant leaving her house in pitch black with a swirling storm above her head. And because of the thunderstorm, she likely would have heard the eerie noises of dogs barking in the distance. I just think for someone as cautious as Asha, going out in conditions like that wouldn't be this fun thing for her. I mean, she didn't even take a coat when she left. The second theory was that she was a legitimate runaway. And if this was the case, it had to be something so unexplained and so unexpected Imagine being soaking wet and then that cold. It would be absolutely unbearable for anyone, let alone a 9-year-old girl. But to run away so suddenly, there would have to be motivation for Asha. She was close to her family due to her own personal relationships with them and their proximity to each other. She loved her friends, and despite having limited technology at home, she had a healthy social life through school, basketball and church. And to everyone's knowledge, there was no rivalries in sport or any bullying going on. By all reports, Harold and Aquila provided their children with everything they could possibly need. Therefore, I think the motivation for Asha wanting to run away would either come from there being something she was uncomfortable with behind closed doors, or if she had a better prospect, perhaps someone she was excited to meet. Some corners of the internet have put implication on Asha's father Harold, mainly because he was the last person to actually see Asha alive, whilst he was checking on the kids. Consequently, the main timeline of the events leading up to Asha's disappearance comes mainly from Harold, who A. wasn't with his wife much towards the latter part of the evening, and B. he did take an unexpected and unplanned trip to the store. This particular theory is mainly made from circumstantial facts, though. Asha's entire family have emphasised the absolute prevailing deep love Harold had for his daughter. He, along with Aquila, had spent so much time and so much money into finding her. He cooperated with the investigation, he passed polygraph tests, and therefore he was legitimately cleared from being a suspect. At times it can be easier for the public to blame a face they're more familiar with, rather than one they just don't know. For example, it's notable Asha went missing on Valentine's Day. Was there someone she was meeting with that both her family and friends were unaware of? Is that why the only way to get out of the house was to sneak off in the middle of the night, whilst her entire family was sleeping? So therefore, this brings me on to the third theory. Did she have motivation to run away to meet someone? Or perhaps she was even groomed by this person. In some ways it is possible children are susceptible to manipulation, and there's a chance the new items in her bag was given to her as a way to gain her trust. Perhaps she had hidden them away in her bag before she had disappeared, and it could simply be that Harold and Aquila just didn't know she had those 2 items. But to me, this is a really hard theory to come to terms with, considering what we know about Asha, because she had always been so wary of strangers. So if Asha really thought there was someone worth meeting, in the dark and in the pouring rain, then they had to have gone above and beyond to earn her trust. This would mean having to see her in person and speaking to her regularly. As I've said before, the degrees didn't really have technology, so this can't have been done online. And typically, if someone grooming her did want to meet her without her parents' knowledge, I would think there are better times to do so. You see, the weather was in fact unprecedented, and even despite all the awful conditions, Asha would have to physically sneak out of the house herself, and then also make sure she didn't wake any of her family members. So if someone had planned to meet her, I think they were taking quite a big risk. Not only were they convinced that she would want to come enough that she would leave her house, walk all that way, in the dark and the rain, but sneaking past her family only increased her chances of being caught. Say Harold had woken up and questioned her, the person's identity likely would have been given up straight away. Personally, I think there were better windows of opportunity, rather than between 3 AM to 4 AM. For example, there was a whole section of time where Harold and Aquila were at work, and Asha and O'Brien were home alone. She could have left within daylight hours. Her brother likely wouldn't have stopped her if she'd made an excuse. She could have just left without a trace. And then there's the speculation about the perpetrator's intentions if Asha had indeed decided to meet them. Were their intentions something sinister? Or perhaps did they want a child of their own? Were they promising her a better life than the one she had? Perhaps she was sick of there being so much discipline at home, and so was enticed at living somewhere where there wouldn't be as many rules. The most rogue theory, in my opinion, out of all the ones people have come up with over the years, was the involvement of a serial killer. North Carolina have had their share of murderous individuals, for example, an infamous one being the Edgecombe County serial killer. But when these violent individuals were active, doesn't match up with Asha's timeline. One possibility was that of Scott Williams, a serial killer who murdered 3 women spanning over 10 years. These homicides took place near Monroe, in North Carolina, only a couple of counties over from Shelby. His whereabouts in 1999 to 2000 were unknown. However, he was also charged with the rape and kidnapping of 2 other women in 1995. The problem with this theory is Williams' pattern of killing. Williams' typical victims were middle-aged white women. He wasn't registered as having any previous altercations with young African-American girls. Not to mention his fingerprints were in the system, so there could have easily been a DNA match with him and any DNA found on Asha's stuff. Unfortunately, in regards to other active killers at the time, there was not enough information to suggest that they would target a young black girl, and I believe this is the absolute pinnacle of police negligence. More often than not, cases involving African American children, teenagers and women remain unsolved. They don't often capture the attention of either the media or the police, meaning there aren't any trends or patterns established in the database. So there's the possibility that there was a serial killer around the time of Asha's disappearance, targeting African American girls in North Carolina, but we'll likely never know. As you can see from everything I've said in this video, Asha's case is truly a saddening and baffling one. I can't even comprehend what the most likely theory would be. What motivates a 9-year-old girl to do something so drastic? A personal theory of mine is a simpler one, and to clarify, it's not something that should be treated as fact. But the more I was thinking about this case, the more I kind of thought, is there a chance the entire thing was fabricated? You see, the established timeline of Asha's movements between 2:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. comes from what could be considered the 2 most unreliable sources in the case. 2 eyewitnesses on the road, in which one of these was a retired deputy police officer, and Asha's father, who was a previous ruled-out suspect because of his late-night trip at 11 p.m. Now, one thing that stuck out to me in particular was this glaringly obvious fact that Asha didn't take her coat. And I mean, she was well aware of the weather conditions. She could hear them outside, and by all accounts, she was meant to be a very intelligent girl. In the early morning hours she went missing, it was so cold. As I've said so many times now, it was nearing sub-zero temperatures. She would have been absolutely sopping wet and more than likely freezing to death. And this was on top of walking a mile to the highway, and then by eyewitness accounts, she waited there for another 30 to 45 minutes. I don't think she could have survived that long. So is there a possibility she got into a car outside her residence, or maybe just up the street? She wouldn't need to take a coat if she didn't think she was going to get very wet. And could she have gone in the family's car, or someone else's? And then there's the matter of what she was wearing. A white shirt without anything to cover it up. The colour white is reflective, so it would be perfect for a particular car to notice her on the highway with their headlights on. Did someone take her to the highway and then drop her off so she could get into another car? Or perhaps the most ominous question of them all, was there any ever legitimate proof she was at Highway 18? The police didn't see her themselves, and there was no video footage. The book bag was found 26 miles away. How do we know any of this actually happened at all? Regardless, throughout the entire duration of Asha's disappearance, Harold and Aquila haven't moved from their 2000 residence. They've always had faith they were going to see Asha again. As of 2024, the police believe they may have had a final breakthrough in the case. Allegedly, they are currently testing unidentified DNA on the Dr. Seuss book alongside Asha's own DNA. In an impactful statement, the current sheriff, Alan Norman, told the media this: "There is movement in this case. This is not a cold case. As technology advances, investigators have more tools than ever to solve the case. New evidence has been collected in the last 24 months. There's someone in Greater Cleveland County that knows where Asha is. And we are going to continue to aggressively identify you to bring closure to this family that's long overdue. My advice to you would be, you've lived with this long enough. And it's time to cleanse your conscience and come forward before we find you first. If anyone out there knows anything about Asha's disappearance, the number to call is 704-484-4888. We can all only hope and pray that the fate of Shelby's sweetheart soon comes to light. Do you think someone close to Asha knows more than they're letting on? Comment yes or no down below.